stood in the shadows of that empty house, the same house they tried to push him out of. He looked back one last time. Not in pain. Not in regret. But in triumph. They didn't just lose a man, they lost the only one who ever held it all together. And by the time they realized it, he was already too far ahead. Stronger. Smarter. Unstoppable. Thank you for watching, brothers. If this hit you somewhere deep, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you felt it too. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Your support keeps this channel alive. Because sometimes, walking away is the greatest revenge of all. The front door clicked shut behind Mark Jensen with a soft thud, the sound swallowed by an unusual silence that instantly unsettled him. He paused in the entryway, his fingers loosening the knot of his tie, trying to shake off the exhaustion from another long day at the firm. The air inside the house felt wrong. Too still. Too quiet. Not the peaceful kind of silence he usually welcomed after 12 hours of client negotiations and courtroom tension. No, this was something heavier. Something thick and suffocating, like walking into a room where the walls themselves were holding their breath. Usually, he'd hear Lana humming in the kitchen or Ryan's video games echoing from upstairs. Ethan might be on the back patio talking on the phone, and his mother, if she was visiting, would be fussing about with her tea or passive-aggressive commentary. But tonight, there was none of that. Just stillness. Mark set his briefcase down gently by the hallway console. Even the click of the leather handle against the wood felt too loud, too stark in the eerie hush. His shoulders tightened. His instincts, a lawyer's, a father's, a man's, told him something was off. Very off. He stepped into the living room and froze. Lana was sitting on the couch, legs crossed neatly, her hands resting in her lap, expression unreadable. To her left was Ethan, stiff and unsmiling, arms folded tightly across his chest. Ryan sat next to him, glancing down at the floor, jaw clenched, like he was bracing for impact. On the armchair across from them sat Chris, Mark's oldest friend, no, former friend, the man he'd once called a brother. And then, there was his mother. She sat poised near the window, chin lifted slightly, eyes cold. Not surprised. Not even uncomfortable. Just detached. The hair on Mark's neck rose. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, calm, professional, even though his gut had already begun to twist. No one answered right away. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Mark's eyes moved between their faces. Lana wouldn't even meet his gaze. Chris looked at him like a man waiting for a meeting to begin, too relaxed, too confident. Then Ethan cleared his throat, his voice sharper than Mark had ever heard from his eldest son. "Dad, you should probably sit down." Mark didn't move. "Why?" Ethan's jaw flexed. "Because, you need to accept a new reality. You're not the head of this family anymore. Chris is more of a father to us now." The words didn't register at first. It was like someone had spoken them in another language. Mark blinked slowly, certain he'd misheard. "Excuse me?" Ethan looked away for a moment, then back. "We've all talked about it. Chris has been here for us. For Mom. For all of us. He's more present. More involved. This," he gestured vaguely around the room, "this just makes more sense now." Mark stood there, rooted to the floor. His heart pounded in his ears, but his face remained still, too still. Years of courtroom control kept his expression neutral, but inside, something snapped. He looked at Lana. Nothing. No apology. No regret. Just silence. He turned to Chris. The man had the audacity to lean back, one leg crossed over the other, arms relaxed across the couch like he belonged there. Like this was his home now. Mark's eyes narrowed slightly. "You've got something to say, Chris?" Chris shrugged with an infuriating calmness. "I'm not here to fight you, man. I care about them. About Lana. About the boys. I've been stepping in where you've been absent. Mark's mother shifted in her seat, exhaling softly. Almost like she'd been waiting for this. Her posture said it all, she was complicit. He scanned his son's faces, searching, begging, for even a flicker of hesitation, a hint of guilt. But Ethan looked resolute. Ryan didn't look up. No one denied it. No one corrected it. That's when it hit him, this wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't a moment of emotional confusion. This was planned. Mark took a step back, straightening his spine. Rage simmered beneath the surface, but he held it down like a soldier trained to keep his composure under fire. Chris is more of a father to you, he repeated, his voice eerily calm. Ethan gave a curt nod. Yeah. Mark didn't even glance at Lana. She had already answered, without a single word. Mark felt the world tilt, not with chaos, but with clarity. This wasn't just infidelity. It wasn't just disrespect. This was erasure. His family, his wife, his sons, his mother, they hadn't just betrayed him. They'd replaced him. They had sat together, had discussions, reached conclusions, without him. They had moved on while he was still playing his role, working, providing, protecting. And now, they were telling him, unapologetically, that he was no longer needed. No longer wanted. That he had become disposable. But they didn't understand the man they were discarding. He wasn't a weak man. He wasn't some emotional wreck they could manipulate into compliance. He was a strategist. A litigator. A fighter. And in that moment, a dark, focused calm settled over him. They thought I'd fall apart. They thought I'd beg. They thought this would break me. But they were wrong. This isn't the night I lost everything, Mark thought, turning slowly toward the door. This is the night I start taking everything back. And when they realized what he was capable of, it would already be too late. Mark didn't slam the door behind him. He didn't scream or demand explanations. He simply turned away from the living room, his footsteps echoing softly through the hallway like a man walking out of his own life. He didn't need to hear another word. Everything he needed to know had already been said, or worse, left unsaid. There was no confusion. No misunderstanding. It was betrayal, deliberate and premeditated, wrapped in silence and smug glances. He walked into his study, the one place in the house untouched by their fingerprints. It was quiet, orderly, familiar. The smell of leather-bound case files and cedar shelves grounded him. He sat down at his desk slowly, deliberately, as if his body had shifted into a different mode, one not driven by emotion, but by strategy. For a moment, he just stared at the wall. Not in shock, not in sadness, but in focus. His mind wasn't unraveling, it was assembling. Piece by piece, he began stacking facts, timelines, relationships. Lana. Chris. His sons. His mother. Each of them had played their role. Each had crossed a line. Mark wasn't going to fight them with screams or shattered furniture. That would be too easy. Too predictable. No, he would do what he did best. He would dismantle them with precision. He opened his laptop, fingers calm on the keys, already compiling a checklist in his head. Emotion was no longer in control. Logic was. And logic was ruthless. The first step was leverage. He pulled up the banking dashboard, logging into every joint account he shared with Lana. He knew their financial map by heart. He'd built it. The house, the cars, the investment portfolios, the credit lines, it was all rooted in him. Within minutes, he initiated account freezes on all shared funds, flagged credit cards for security lockdowns, and called the bank's senior manager directly to ensure execution without delay. Yes, all joint accounts. No exceptions. And remover access immediately. There was a pause. Yes, I'm fully aware this includes the household accounts. Proceed. He didn't hesitate. Next came the trust funds, education savings, emergency reserves, even the luxury spending cards tied to Lana's private account. She thought they were hers, but Mark had set up the access years ago. He revoked her authorization with a few clicks, cutting off her financial lifelines. Then he called his financial advisor. "Gerald, I need immediate asset restructuring. Move everything under my sole name. Liquidate the investment shares she has visibility on. Transfer my silent equities to offshore holdings under the shell firms we discussed last quarter." Gerald stammered slightly. Mark's voice was too calm, too purposeful. "Effective now. Not tomorrow. Now." As soon as that was done, he dialed his attorney. "No delays, Jonathan. Emergency divorce filing. Irreconcilable differences. Full asset protection clause. I want every inch of my contributions documented and filed before the end of the day. Also, initiate custody provisions, even if it's symbolic. This isn't about parenting anymore. It's about positioning." Jonathan's voice was hesitant. "Are you sure you want to move this fast?" "I've never been more certain in my life," Mark replied flatly. He wasn't done. Not even close. He started compiling a list of every investor, client, and partner he had ever referred to Chris's company, names, companies, contacts. He opened a separate file titled Reversal Plan. It would be a slow, methodical bleeding, one investor at a time, one contract at a time. Chris wouldn't know what hit him until he was already drowning. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about reminding them all who he really was. Not the absent husband. Not the replaceable father. Not the silent provider. He was the man who built their world, and now he was going to tear it down, brick by brick. As the documents processed and confirmations rolled in, Mark leaned back in his chair and stared out the window, eyes unfocused but mind racing. For the first time in years, he saw himself with brutal clarity, not as the father, the husband, the provider, but as the man who had quietly carried the weight of everyone else's comfort without ever asking for anything in return. He thought about the late nights at the firm, the deals negotiated over sleepless hours, the promotions he turned down just to be home more often, the vacations he paid for, the birthdays he never forgot, the sacrifices that were never acknowledged. He remembered the small things too, cleaning out the gutters himself so Lana wouldn't worry, staying up late to help Ethan with his college applications, handing Ryan his first set of car keys with pride, not knowing that one day that same boy would look him in the eye and say he'd been replaced. He had given them everything, piece by piece, until all that was left was a man who had become invisible in his own home. But now he wasn't invisible. He was awakened. Betrayal has a way of stripping away illusions, and what remained beneath was someone stronger, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. The man who once sacrificed for love was gone. In his place stood someone they should have never underestimated. Power wasn't in yelling or threatening. Power wasn't even in money. It was in understanding where the strings were and knowing exactly how to pull them. Mark had spent years building those strings, those networks, those layers of influence. While others socialized, he nurtured business ties. While others relied on luck, he created systems, relationships, leverage. The same network that helped Chris build his company was Mark's. The clients who poured money into those contracts did so because Mark vouched for him. The banks that approved loans did so because of Mark's standing. Chris had never been a leader, he was a proxy, a man riding the coattails of someone he thought he could replace. But Mark didn't need to shout to make walls crumble. He just needed to make a few calls, shake a few hands, shift a few numbers. He knew every vulnerability in Chris's business, every dependency, every investor, every partnership that could be severed with a phone call. And Lana, she never understood the foundation she walked on. She thought power was control over hearts, over attention, over emotion. But real power was access. Real power was leverage. Real power was silence followed by consequences. And Mark had all three in abundance. The first cracks appeared the next morning when Lana tried to place an online order from her favorite boutique. The screen blinked red, transaction declined. She frowned, refreshed the page, tried again. Same result. Maybe it was a glitch, she thought, brushing off the unease. But when her attempt to transfer funds from the household account failed, the concern grew heavier. She checked the app on her phone, error messages, access denied, unresponsive balances. Her credit card wouldn't even load her available limit. Confusion turned into alarm. She grabbed her purse, slid into the luxury SUV Mark had gifted her on her birthday, and drove straight to the bank. The customer service representative smiled politely at first, but his expression slowly changed as he pulled up the account details. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Jensen," he said carefully, "but there's been a legal freeze placed on all joint accounts. We no longer have authorization to allow access without Mr. Jensen's consent." Lana's face flushed, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk. "That's ridiculous, I've had access to these accounts for years." "Yes, ma'am," the banker nodded, "but the legal documentation is airtight. Your access has been formally revoked." As the reality began to sink in, Lana's voice dropped to a whisper, disbelief painted across her face. He actually did it." The humiliation clung to her like a second skin as she walked out of the bank, her phone already pressed to her ear, trying to reach Chris. She needed a lifeline. But Chris had problems of his own. The collapse of Peter's business, now rebranded under Chris's name in their inner circle, was swift and surgical. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly. One of his oldest clients sent a brief email terminating future contracts. The wording was formal, impersonal, but the message was clear: they were pulling out. The next day, another partner cited a restructuring of priorities and severed ties. By week's end, 3 major investors had backed out, each one delivering the same vague corporate excuse, yet Chris knew better. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't market fluctuation. This was deliberate. He tried calling a few of them directly, but his calls were screened, his voicemails unreturned. Panic began to creep in, disguised behind forced smiles and shallow reassurances to his staff. Suppliers grew hesitant. Payment terms changed. Contracts once rock solid suddenly became vulnerable to renegotiation or outright cancellation. And beneath it all was the whisper he feared most: Mark Jensen was no longer standing behind him. Chris had built his empire on borrowed credibility, unaware that it came with an invisible leash, and now, Mark was yanking it hard. Ethan was the first to feel the shift. It started with a simple email from the university's finance office, a notification that his tuition payment had not gone through. At first, he assumed it was a technical error. His father had always handled the payments without fail, without question. But when he logged into his student account and saw the bright red alert flashing across the top, * payment overdue. Enrollment at risk if not resolved within 7 days *, a cold knot formed in his stomach. He reached for his phone immediately, dialing the bank. The answer came quickly and with clinical finality: his access had been revoked, the linked funding account no longer recognized him as an authorized user. He tried the backup card Mark had given him a year ago, declined. In a quiet panic, he called Ryan, hoping maybe it was a system-wide glitch. But Ryan was already fuming. His monthly allowance had vanished without warning, his debit card declined when he tried to buy gas that morning. When he checked his app, the balance was 0. Not low, *0*. "He's cutting us off," Ryan said flatly, pacing his room, voice tight with disbelief. "He's actually cutting us off." For the first time in their lives, the weight of dependency hit them square in the chest. They both tried calling him. First Ethan, then Ryan, then both at once. The phone rang, went to voicemail. Messages were left, half composed of frustration, half thinly veiled panic. When there was no response, they tried email, long apologetic paragraphs riddled with guilt and desperation, begging for a conversation. But Mark didn't answer. He didn't even acknowledge receipt. His silence was louder than any argument. It wasn't spiteful, it was surgical. It wasn't punishment, it was consequence. And slowly, that silence began to unravel them. The report arrived in a sealed envelope hand-delivered to Mark's office, courtesy of the private investigator he had hired the same night he walked out of that living room. He didn't open it right away. He poured himself a black coffee, sat at his desk, and took a deep breath before slicing the seal with his letter opener. As he flipped through the photos and documentation inside, the weight of what he saw settled over him like a fresh betrayal all over again, but this time, it wasn't Chris's name attached to the images. It was Matthew. His own younger brother. There were photos of clandestine meetings, Lana and Matthew at a secluded restaurant 2 towns over, leaning in close, hands touching under the table. A few shots outside a hotel entrance, her hand brushing his arm in a way that screamed intimacy. But it was the printed email transcripts that twisted Mark's stomach into something sharp and sick. Conversations between Lana and Matthew dating back months, long before Chris ever came into the picture. Whispers of "I wish it could be you," and "soon, everything will be ours," and even one message chilling in its simplicity, * he's too busy to see what's right in front of him. * This wasn't a fling. It was a calculated coup. Chris had merely been the distraction, the convenient fall guy. The real betrayal ran deeper, closer. It came from blood. He sat in silence, letting the pieces rearrange themselves in his memory. The time Lana insisted they cancel a trip because of family obligations, only to disappear for a weekend under vague explanations. The way Matthew started showing up more often at family dinners, helping himself to the bar cabinet like he owned the place. The sudden closeness, the private jokes between them that felt off. Mark remembered how his mother once smiled knowingly when Matthew made a comment about how some people don't appreciate what they have at home. At the time, it had seemed like nothing, just a poorly worded joke. But now, in retrospect, every moment was a flashing red light he had chosen to ignore. Not because he was naive, but because he trusted the people who should have never been trusted. Mark stared at the last page in the report, his hands trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what it meant. This wasn't just infidelity. It wasn't just humiliation. It was betrayal in its purest, most venomous form. His own brother. The boy he once carried on his shoulders, the man he defended in family arguments, the one he helped through college, paid off debts for, covered mistakes without judgment, that man had been sleeping with his wife behind his back. It wasn't just Lana who tore the family apart, it was Matthew who drove the knife in deeper, slower, cleaner. The pain in Mark's chest wasn't just heartbreak anymore, it was something darker, something colder. Rage, heartbreak, disbelief, they all converged into a single, suffocating weight in his lungs. Every memory of brotherhood now tasted bitter, every family photo a lie. He felt robbed, not just of trust, but of history, of legacy, of identity. The people he had loved the most had not only betrayed him, they'd done it while looking him in the eye, smiling across the dinner table, sharing toasts and holidays while secretly planning his undoing. It was a storm unlike any he'd weathered before, but he wasn't running from it. He was becoming it. The strategy shifted in his mind with sharp precision. The chessboard had changed. This was no longer about a failed marriage or a lost friendship, this was a war of blood, and betrayal from blood carried a different consequence. He adjusted his plans, added new names to the list. Matthew's financial records would be torn open next. His connections, his job, his reputation, nothing would be spared. Mark was no longer playing defense. He was taking the fight into their camp. And this time, he wasn't aiming to hurt. He was aiming to destroy. The following evening, Mark stood in front of his mother's house, the porch light casting a warm glow that felt painfully deceptive. He hadn't planned to come here so soon, but after everything he had uncovered, there was one more piece he needed to confront directly. He knocked once and opened the door without waiting for an answer. She was seated in her usual chair, sipping tea like nothing in the world had changed, like her son's life hadn't been ripped apart at the seams. She looked up, mildly surprised but not alarmed. "Mark," she said with a calm nod, "you didn't call." "No," he said, shutting the door behind him. "Didn't think you deserved the courtesy." Her lips tightened slightly, but she didn't speak. Mark walked in, pacing slowly, arms crossed. He didn't waste time. "You knew," he said flatly. "Not just about Lana and Chris. You knew about Matthew." She didn't flinch. That alone made something twist inside him. "You didn't just know," he continued, voice low, "you helped push it." His mother exhaled softly, as if she'd been expecting this moment all along. "I didn't push anything," she said, tone too smooth, too practiced. "I just guided what was inevitable." Mark's eyes burned into hers. "You're telling me you encouraged my wife to sleep with my brother because you thought it was inevitable?" "I encouraged her to choose what made her feel valued," she replied coldly. "You were always somewhere else, in court, in meetings, building a legacy that didn't involve anyone but yourself." Lana was lonely. She needed something you weren't giving her. Mark clenched his fists. "So you handed her to my brother?" "I didn't hand her to anyone," she snapped, the first crack in her controlled demeanor showing. "But yes, I spoke to her. I told her not to waste her life waiting for a man who was already married to his career. I told her Matthew could give her a different kind of life. One where she'd be seen." Silence fell between them, thick and heavy. Mark stared at her, jaw tight, eyes unreadable. "You didn't just betray me," he said after a moment, voice low and steady. "You betrayed your own son. Your blood." "No," she said firmly, standing now, teacup still in hand. "You betrayed yourself the day you forgot how to be a husband. I just stopped pretending you didn't." Mark took one step forward, leaning in slightly. "You'll regret aligning yourself with the wrong man. Because the son you once molded is gone. And what's left doesn't care about family loyalty anymore." He turned and walked away without another word, leaving her standing in her perfect little living room, sipping tea like a queen over a kingdom that was already burning. As Mark drove away from his mother's house, her words echoed in his mind like a venomous chant masked in civility. It wasn't about Lana. It wasn't even about Matthew. This had always been about her, about control, power, and legacy. She never wanted a son who stood on his own. She wanted someone malleable, someone tethered to her expectations, someone she could shape into her vision of a perfect legacy. Mark's independence had always been an irritation to her, a deviation from the script she had written before he was even born. He realized now she had never truly celebrated his success, it had always come with backhanded compliments and subtle corrections. In her mind, he belonged to her narrative, not his own. And when she couldn't mold him, she redirected her influence toward those she could: Lana, Ethan, Ryan, even Matthew. She didn't care about their happiness. She cared about ensuring that the next generation stayed under her thumb, under her watchful gaze, dancing to her orchestrated version of what a family should be. Mark had simply become an obstacle in a legacy she wanted to control, not a son to be respected. His mind drifted, uninvited, to memories buried beneath years of distraction. He remembered being 15 and winning a state-level debate competition, only for her to comment on how messy his posture looked on stage. He remembered choosing law school over business school and hearing her sigh, "Well, I suppose you'll do all right, even if it's not the path I would have taken." He remembered the first time he brought Lana home, how his mother praised her elegance more than her character, how she smiled in quiet satisfaction when Lana mirrored her opinions more than his. Every milestone he'd ever reached, every success he'd earned, had been met with passive resistance or manipulative guidance. She had been undermining him from the beginning, and he had mistaken it for guidance. The realization left him hollow for a moment, not with grief, but with a deeper understanding of the battlefield he was standing on. He wasn't just a man betrayed by his wife or backstabbed by a brother. He was a man systematically stripped of trust by every person he should have been able to lean on. Yet somehow, in that desolate realization, strength began to take root. There was no more confusion. No more hesitation. Mark wasn't alone. He was just finally free from illusion. And now that the mask had been ripped off, there was nothing left to fear, only work left to finish. The house, once filled with warmth and routine, had turned into a battleground of whispered arguments and slamming doors. Ethan paced in the hallway outside Ryan's room, jaw clenched, holding a crumpled printout in his hand, bank transactions, screenshots, messages he'd stumbled upon accidentally while trying to resolve his own financial mess. But now the truth was written in numbers and timestamps. "You took money from Uncle Matthew," he snapped, voice sharp and shaking with disbelief. Ryan stood frozen, caught off guard. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb," Ethan hissed, stepping closer, shoving the paper against his chest. "He paid you. 1,000 here, 5,000 there, monthly transfers labeled as consulting fees. You don't even have a damn job." Ryan's expression shifted from surprise to defensive anger. "It wasn't like that." "Then explain it," Ethan shouted. "Explain why you've been sitting on this while the rest of us were pretending we had a real family. You knew what was going on. You knew what he was doing with Mom." "I didn't know all of it," Ryan snapped back. "He said it was for helping him with a side project. I didn't ask questions." "Because you didn't want to know," Ethan growled. "You kept your mouth shut and let me look my father in the eyes and tell him he was no longer part of this family, all while pocketing money from the same man screwing his wife." The tension boiled over. Voices rose, accusations flew, and before long, the shouting turned into shoving. The illusion of brotherhood cracked wide open. There was no loyalty left, only resentment, regret, and the bitter realization that the betrayal hadn't just come from outside but had poisoned them from within. Mark watched it all from a distance. He didn't need to be in the room to see it unfolding. He heard the yelling echo down the hallway of the house he no longer called home, each word a confirmation that the fracture he had once tried to prevent had split entirely. He stood in the shadows of the entryway, unseen, unnoticed. And for a brief moment, he didn't feel anger. He felt clarity. This was the natural consequence of lies stacked upon lies, truth erupting in the absence of structure, guilt boiling when consequences finally arrived. He didn't step in. He didn't mediate. He didn't try to fix what they had chosen to break. They wanted a world without him, and now they had it. The shouting eventually died down, replaced by a heavy, unbearable silence that settled across the house like a fog. Ethan sat on the edge of the couch, his face in his hands, the printouts now crumpled and forgotten on the floor. His shoulders sagged under the weight of realization, eyes glazed with something far heavier than anger, shame. Across the room, Ryan stood by the window, arms crossed tightly, jaw clenched, but even his posture had lost its usual defiance. He wasn't defending his actions anymore. He was simply trying to breathe through the guilt gnawing at him from the inside. Neither spoke for a while. There was nothing left to say. They were no longer two brothers bonded by family, they were just two young men drowning in the wreckage of their own choices. Every luxury they had taken for granted, every comfort they had assumed would always be there, had been held together by the very man they so carelessly dismissed. And now, with that foundation gone, they were standing in the ruins of their own ignorance. The identity crisis crept in slowly. If they weren't Mark Jensen's sons in character or principle, then what were they? Just bystanders to their mother's betrayal? Enablers of a deception they never dared question? Mark stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, gaze steady and ice-cold. They looked up at him, unsure whether to apologize, explain, or beg. But he offered them no lifeline, no lecture, no comfort. He looked at them for a long, heavy moment, then spoke in a tone so even and sharp it cut more than any raised voice ever could. "You called someone else father, now live without one." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving behind the echo of the truth they now had to carry alone. The decision wasn't dramatic. There were no late-night declarations, no final confrontations, no emotional goodbyes. Mark simply walked into the real estate office one morning, signed the papers, and sold the house. Every room, every hallway, every memory was boxed, labeled, and removed without sentiment. The house that had once echoed with family dinners and holiday laughter now felt like a mausoleum of betrayal. The luxury vehicles in the garage, once symbols of status and success, were listed and sold off in a week. Jewelry, art, collectibles, all liquidated. There was nothing worth keeping, nothing that didn't carry the scent of lies or the fingerprints of people who once called him replaceable. He closed his personal accounts tied to the city, severed business affiliations, and declined farewell dinners from colleagues. When people asked why, he offered only a quiet smile and a vague answer, just time for a change. But deep down, he wasn't running from the wreckage. He was discarding it, like dead skin that no longer served him. He didn't need revenge anymore. He had already delivered it. What he needed now was distance, a clean slate. And so, with nothing but a few suitcases and a heart stripped clean of attachment, Mark left. The new city welcomed him not with grandeur, but with silence, and that was exactly what he wanted. He settled into a modest apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a quiet street, far removed from the chaos he had left behind. He opened a private consultancy, something he had always dreamed of but never pursued while tied down by obligations. Clients came steadily, old contacts who respected his name, new ones who admired his clarity and discretion. There were no late dinners to rush home to, no strained smiles across dining tables filled with resentment. For the first time in years, Mark lived for himself. He took long walks in the park, read novels he never had time for, and rediscovered the calm that had been buried beneath years of being everything for everyone else. He wasn't rebuilding what was lost, he was creating something new, something untouched by betrayal. And in that simplicity, in that quiet freedom, he found something he hadn't felt in years: peace. The peace he found wasn't just personal, it became purposeful. One afternoon, while sitting by the window overlooking the quiet city street, Mark began drafting the blueprint for something that had been resting in the back of his mind for years. He called it the Jensen Legacy Foundation, named not for himself, but for his father, a man of quiet strength and uncompromising integrity, the kind of man who had never needed attention to make an impact. The foundation's mission was simple: provide scholarships and mentorship programs for young professionals from underprivileged backgrounds who wanted to pursue law or business. It wasn't about charity, it was about empowerment. About giving others the tools to stand on their own, just as Mark had done. He funded it entirely from the assets reclaimed in the fallout, assets once used to build a life for people who turned their backs on him. Now, those same resources would build futures for those who deserved it. He worked with a small team, kept the operations lean, and ensured that every dollar flowed directly to the people who needed it most. It wasn't just an act of healing, it was a declaration. He hadn't just walked away from betrayal. He had turned the ruins into something beautiful, something lasting, something no one could ever take away. The call came on a gray, rainy afternoon. He let it ring the first few times, already knowing who it was. When he finally answered, Lana's voice cracked through the line, soft, frantic, drenched in regret. She begged to meet, pleaded for understanding, wept about mistakes and second chances. She asked if he remembered their wedding vows, if he remembered the good times, the laughter, the years they shared. He listened quietly, letting her pour out every tear-soaked memory, every hollow justification. And when she finally paused to catch her breath, asking if there was any love left, he responded with the same steady calm he had carried since the day everything fell apart. "That's nice," he said, voice devoid of malice, "but I don't love you." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, broken only by the faint sound of her sobbing. He didn't say another word. He didn't hang up in anger. He just let the silence speak for him. And when he finally ended the call, he didn't feel a trace of pain. Only freedom. It was a cold evening when Peter showed up unannounced. Mark had just returned from a meeting with one of the foundation's donors when a knock came, sharp, urgent, hesitant. He opened the door and found the man who had once been closer than family standing there, disheveled, eyes hollow, the weight of loss etched into every line of his face. Peter looked like a man unraveling, barely held together by whatever fragments of dignity he still clung to. "Mark," he said quietly, as if saying the name might soften what he had done. Mark didn't invite him in. He simply stepped aside enough to acknowledge his presence, then folded his arms. I need to talk," Peter said. "Please." Mark said nothing, but his silence gave space for the unraveling to begin. Peter stepped forward, eyes darting as if searching for some trace of the man who once called him brother. I know I messed up. I know what I did can't be erased. But I swear, it wasn't just me. Lana, she used me too. She made it sound like you didn't care anymore. Like you were just going through the motions. She told me things, manipulated things, things I was stupid enough to believe. And he paused, voice cracking. I thought maybe I could give her something better. I thought I was doing the right thing. But I wasn't. I was blind. His shoulders slumped, the guilt finally crushing through the surface. I lost everything, Mark. The investors are gone, the business is dead, my name's mud in every room I once had power in. I'm broke, I'm alone, and I'm sorry. I just wanted to say it. I needed you to hear it. Mark didn't respond right away. He just stared at him, eyes devoid of sympathy. He let the silence stretch long enough for Peter to shift uncomfortably. Then, in a voice low and steady, Mark finally spoke. You betrayed a brother. You don't come back from that. Peter's face fell. I didn't mean, but you did, Mark cut in. You thought I wouldn't see it. You thought I wouldn't fight back. You thought you could replace me in my own life and that I'd just fade away. But now you see what happens when a man who builds everything gets pushed out. He takes everything with him. Peter's shoulders dropped further, lips parted as if searching for more words, but none came. Mark didn't need to say anything else. He closed the door slowly, firmly, letting the final click echo in the hallway like a verdict. Peter's downfall didn't come all at once, it came in slow, relentless waves, each one pulling him deeper into a reality he could no longer outrun. The day after Mark shut the door in his face, a letter arrived from the State Business Commission. His company was under formal investigation for financial misrepresentation, triggered by the investors Mark had once connected him with. The ones now testifying against him. Lawsuits followed like vultures circling a dying animal. Former clients came forward with grievances, accounts of unethical practices, inflated invoices, mishandled funds. Without Mark's reputation to shield him, Peter was just another fraud in a collapsing empire. Banks recalled loans, credit lines dried up, and his once prized office space was emptied, equipment repossessed, and staff laid off. The name that had once opened doors now closed them before he could even knock. At home, the damage spread faster. His wife, tired of the stress and now aware of the full extent of his affair with Lana, packed her bags and left without a word. His teenage son, once proud to bear his last name, refused to speak to him. Friends stopped answering his calls, and former colleagues offered nothing more than rehearsed condolences and closed doors. Peter tried to salvage what he could, but there was nothing left to hold on to. No business. No family. No identity. He became a ghost in his own life, a man who had gambled everything on betrayal and lost it all. The confident charm, the easy arrogance, gone. Now he was just a hollow shell wandering through the ruins of a kingdom he never truly owned, haunted by the echo of a door that closed with more finality than any courtroom sentence ever could. The evening sun filtered through the tall windows of Mark's apartment, casting a soft amber hue across the hardwood floors. The quiet was comforting, not hollow, not suffocating like the silence he once endured in his old home. Here, it was different. It was intentional. It was earned. He moved through his space slowly, pouring a glass of wine, settling into the armchair by the window, watching the world outside without urgency or regret. There were no distractions, no hidden agendas, no masks to navigate. Just peace, deep, unshakable peace. He didn't spend his days replaying the betrayal or fantasizing about revenge. That part of his life was behind him, sealed off like a chapter in a book he had no interest in reopening. He had nothing left to prove, no one left to confront. The war had ended long ago, and the scars it left behind had turned into reminders, not of pain, but of strength. He wasn't angry anymore. He was free. The envelope arrived on a quiet Wednesday morning, slipped discreetly into the mail slot. Mark hadn't expected anything of significance, most of his correspondence was digital these days. But when he saw Ethan's handwriting on the front, something paused in his chest for a moment. He held the letter for a while before opening it, the weight of the past brushing gently against his fingers. Inside was a handwritten note, no theatrics, no justifications, just simple, earnest words. Ethan apologized. Not just for what he had said that night, but for how long he had taken his father's presence for granted. He admitted the influence others had over him, the weakness in his character, the confusion he'd mistaken for conviction. He wrote about how much he had learned in Mark's absence, about strength, about sacrifice, about what it really meant to be a man. He wrote that he didn't expect forgiveness, only understanding. Mark read the letter twice, slowly, thoughtfully, absorbing each word with the same careful attention he had once given to legal briefs. When he finished, he folded it back into the envelope and set it on the table beside him. He didn't feel compelled to respond. Not because he didn't care, but because there was nothing left to say. The letter didn't undo the past, nor was it meant to. It was simply a marker, evidence that his silence had spoken louder than any argument ever could. And that was enough. Sometimes, strength isn't in how loudly you fight, it's in how gracefully you walk away. They thought he was the weak link, the expendable piece, the background figure who'd quietly vanish. But they were wrong. He had always been the structure, the spine, the force holding everything together. And when the backbone walks away, the body crumbles. That was the lesson. Not just for them, but for him. That no matter how much you give, how much you build, how deeply you love, if those around you mistake your presence for permanence, they'll never understand your worth until you're gone. And once you walk away, once you reclaim your power, there's no going back. Because peace, once earned, is something no one can steal again. If your own family turned against you, would you fight to fix it, or walk away and let them burn in their own fire? Would you beg for a place in a home built on lies, or would you rebuild yourself from the ashes they thought you'd never rise from? What would you do if your wife, your mother, and your children looked you in the eye and treated you like a placeholder, a background figure, a provider to be discarded? Would you stay and be broken, or walk away and be reborn? Never forget, betrayal doesn't define you. What you do afterward does. You are not just a man, you are the foundation of everything they take for granted. You are the roof they never thanked, the wall they leaned on without notice, the strength they assumed would always be there. And when the foundation walks away, everything else collapses. Don't crumble. Don't beg. Be the storm they never saw coming. Stand taller. Move forward. And let them learn the hard way what happens when a good man chooses to rise alone.